Gospel reading for this week comes from John chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This is a kind of a strange text to bring in this week in the season of Easter. This gospel passage is actually from John's account of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. So we're going backwards a little bit before the resurrection and before the crucifixion. Jesus has just washed his disciples' feet. Judas has just betrayed him, and Peter will soon deny Jesus. As Jesus was getting ready to leave his disciples, as he was preparing to die, this was what Jesus wanted his disciples to know and to do. Often when people know that they are getting close to death, their priorities and what is most important becomes very clear. And for Jesus, imparting this command to his disciples was the most important thing. Jesus got right to the point. He didn't offer a parable that needed to be interpreted. He simply told his disciples to love one another. Jesus wanted all of his children to experience love from God and love from one another. And the way that Jesus did this says a lot. When Judas left and betrayed Jesus, I don't think anyone would have judged Jesus if he had responded by condemning Judas or talking about how evil he was because of all the terrific impact it would have on Jesus. But instead, Jesus continues to allow everything to flow and be put into motion. Jesus began to speak to his disciples with the phrase, "my little children," a term of deep endearment, indicating that Jesus saw his followers as family, as intimate as one's own children. Jesus reiterated his mission and continued to teach his disciples about what was most important as he prepared to leave them. He prepared them for his absence by promising them that though he would be physically gone from them, they would not be abandoned. Love disrupts the betrayal and the pending denial. Jesus washed the feet and fed Judas, who would betray him. And Judas washed the feet and fed Peter, who would deny him. Jesus washed the feet and fed all the other disciples who would fail to stand by him in his hour of greatest need and distress. The love that Jesus showed was not based on what the disciples deserved or earned. Jesus then told them and us to love in this way. Jesus didn't say, believe this right way, or be sure to go to church every Sunday, or make sure you say a prayer before every meal. He simply said, love one another. It is simple in some senses. It's clear, it's concise, uncomplicated. But it's not so simple when we talk about how we actually carry it out. It's simple enough that kids could easily memorize it and repeat it, and yet it is so deep, difficult, and profound that even those who have been disciples for decades fail to fully grasp and live it out. When I first started reflecting on this passage this week, my first thought was to try to figure out what it means for us to love one another here in Livingston in May 2022. It seemed like the right question, and it seemed like finding the right answer is paramount, not only to understanding and living out this passage, but also to living out the entirety of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. And so I racked my brain trying to find the answer of what we might be called to do in this specific time and place to live out this passage. And honestly, I think I was hoping for an easy and simple answer. If I loved so-and-so in this specific way today, then I would have followed Jesus's command, and I could check that box and move on. And I hoped for a simple answer to tell all of you. But of course, it's more complicated than this. And even if I could figure out an answer to what to do to love one another here today, I know that I have failed again and again to love others as God has commanded, and I know that I will continue to fail to do this. Anytime when two or more people come together, you will inevitably have challenges about how to relate to one another, how to work with one another, and how to care for one another. And the church is no exception to this. The church is a messy place because people are messy. But the difference in the church is that Jesus calls us to love one another. And the point is to demonstrate God's love, to embody God's love. Our love shows that we are Jesus's disciples, and if people know this, then they will know God and know God's love. It is through us that people will experience God and know God's love. Jesus commands us to love one another. It's not a suggestion, but also love doesn't seem like something that can be forced. When I was little, my sister and I didn't get along very well. We have opposite personalities, and at a young age, we didn't want to or didn't know how to get along with one another. When one of us did something especially bad to the other, I can recall on a number of occasions, my mom would make us say sorry to the other. And sometimes we even had to say, "I love you," and give the other a hug. And I can guarantee you that in those moments, there was not much actual love going on between us. Saying "I love you" and hugging was usually done with great anger, resentment, and resistance. We might have acted like we loved each other, but it was far from an authentic love. And what Jesus commands us about loving one another isn't about faking it until you make it. It's not about acting or behaving as if you love somebody without that authentic accompanying love. Jesus tells us to love. And to love means to serve one another in menial tasks, and it extends as far as giving one's life for others. Love is giving of the self. It is by this sort of love that other people will know who God's disciples are. Authentic, actual love as deep and wide as the love Jesus demonstrated to us. Perhaps it's an impossible command. Tears came to my eyes as I read the news from Buffalo, New York this week. On Saturday afternoon, 10 people were killed and 3 more wounded at a supermarket by a man who left a manifesto outlining his plan to kill as many Black people as possible. The gunman was motivated by the racist idea that white Americans are at risk of being replaced by people of color. Of the 13 people shot, 11 were Black, 2 were white. The victims included a security guard at the store, a former police officer, and an 86-year-old mother of 4 who stopped to get something to eat after her daily visit to her husband at the nursing home where he lives. I lament that despite this command from Jesus to love one another, that we are so far from living it out. Reading the news reminded me yet again of the impossibility of loving one another. It reminded me of my implicit responsibility in acts of racism. It reminded me of the immense tragedy that results when we fail to love one another. And so I wonder if the question is less, how do we love one another, but rather, how are we loved? The only way that this sort of love is going to be possible is through the transformation that we experience by being loved by Jesus. And so I wonder what might happen if we focused on the love that we receive from God and being ever more transformed by that love. What if we first tended to our own spirits and the love of Jesus that we experience? What if we first allow God's love to transform us? Might that love so transform us that our love for one another is also transformed? I don't think it's a linear process. I think it has to be a cyclical process of being transformed by God's love. And then that love flows out to one another. And in the process, our hearts are further transformed by God. And then we can more deeply love one another as our own sense of being loved deepens. We don't have to conjure up this deep love out of thin air. We don't have to wear ourselves out by trying to live out this impossible love. We are invited by Jesus first and foremost to experience the love that Jesus has for us. It is only through this source of love that we are then able to love others. It is God's love that changes us and empowers us to love one another. And even when it's incredibly difficult and even impossible to truly love one another, God's love will continue to break through into us and to break through to do a new thing. So hear these words again from Jesus. I have loved you. May you know in every part of your being that you are loved. May God's love sustain you. May God's love disrupt. And may God's love flow in and through you in this community of faith. Amen.